Welcome back to Mad Hatter's Civil War History. In today's episode, we get a little wet. We travel down to Alabama and examine the Battle of Mobile Bay. The Battle of Mobile Bay, fought from August 2nd to August 23rd, 1864, was a significant naval engagement during the American Civil War. This battle, led by Union Admiral David Farragut, aimed to close one of the last major Confederate ports on the Gulf of Mexico, Mobile Bay, Alabama. The battle began with Farragut's fleet, which included 4 ironclad monitors and more than a dozen wooden ships, attempting to breach the heavily fortified entrance to Mobile Bay. The Confederate defenses were formidable, consisting of 3 forts, Fort Morgan, Fort Gaines, and Fort Powell, along with a small fleet led by the ironclad CSS Tennessee. On the night of August 4th, 1864, Admiral Farragut, aboard his flagship USS Hartford, prepared his fleet for the assault. The next morning, as the fleet advanced, the ironclad Tecumseh struck a mine and sank, causing a momentary panic among the Union forces. It was during this critical moment that Farragut is famously quoted as saying, "Damn the torpedoes! Full speed ahead!" This order exemplified his determination and boldness as he led his fleet through the minefield and into the bay. The Union fleet faced fierce resistance from the Confederate forts and the CSS Tennessee. The Tennessee, commanded by Admiral Franklin Buchanan, was a formidable opponent with its thick armor and powerful guns. Despite its strengths, the Tennessee had several flaws, including slow speed and exposed tiller chains, which ultimately contributed to his downfall. The relentless assault eventually disabled the Tennessee, forcing its surrender. The fall of the Tennessee marked the end of the naval engagement, but the battle for Mobile Bay continued on land. Union forces, led by General Gordon Granger, laid siege to Fort Gaines and Fort Morgan. Fort Gaines surrendered on August 7th, and Fort Morgan followed on August 23rd, effectively closing Mobile Bay to Confederate blockade runners. The Union victory at Mobile Bay was a significant blow to the Confederacy. It not only closed a vital port, but also boosted Northern morale and contributed to the re-election of President Abraham Lincoln later that year. The battle demonstrated the importance of naval power in the Civil War and solidified Admiral Farragut's reputation as one of the greatest naval commanders in American history. On the night of August 4th, 1864, in the cabin of his flagship, the USS Hartford, Admiral Farragut read his Bible, arriving at the ultimate assurance that God was on his side. Then there was a knock on his door. "Admiral," asked an officer, "won't you give the sailors a glass of grog in the morning? Not enough to get them drunk, but just enough to make them fight well." "No, sir, I never found that I need rum to enable me to do my duty. I will order 2 good cups of coffee to each man at 2 a.m., and at 8 a.m. I will pipe all hands to breakfast in Mobile Bay." Much farther north and east, in Richmond, Virginia, Confederate States President Davis also resorted to prayer and wired the defenders of the environs of Mobile, Alabama, "May our Heavenly Father shield you and direct you so as to divert the threatening disaster." In the city of Mobile, newspapers confidently predicted that Farragut could fire until the end of the war, but the forts guarding the harbor would still stand. The men inside Fort Morgan bragged that because they could hit a bobbing barrel at 1,000 yards, they could knock the Hartford out of the water. Mobile was by far the most important Gulf of Mexico port used by blockade runners, New Orleans having fallen to Northern forces in April of 1862. At first, running the blockade had been made easy. Mobile was infused by a giddy and gay atmosphere in those days. Young men in flashy uniforms were leaving for army camps, accompanied by colorful celebrations and grandiose oratory and levity. Schoolboys toting wooden guns drilled in the streets, and anxious businessmen of Northern loyalty quietly left town. Southerners could afford to joke about the Union blockade in 1861. Equipped with just 50 warships, more or less, the U.S. Navy had to cover 3,550 miles of southern coastline, 189 harbors or inlets, and 9 major seaports. But by the summer of 1864, Southerners found nothing humorous about the blockade. Almost 500 warships patrolled the coastline and rivers. Eluding capture was not an easy task for the runners. The odds of capture, 1 in 10 in 1861, were now 1 in 3. Yet Mobile was even more difficult to blockade than the Carolina ports. The distance from Pensacola to the Rio Grande was about 600 miles, not counting the Mississippi River Delta. Behind this coast is an intricate network of inland waterways in which shallow draft craft could move safely to find an exit or inlet not covered by the blockaders. The Federal warships patrolling outside Mobile Bay were part of Farragut's West Gulf blockading squadron, and duty was routinely mundane and monotonous, punctuated by moments of high drama. Aboard each ship, a deck officer, posted aloft in the bosun chair, scanned the dark horizon, moonless nights being favored by blockade runners, straining to spot the silhouette of a runner or a distant plume of smoke. If a runner was sighted, a signal rocket would streak through the night, sending seamen to their battle stations, and with steam up, the chase was on. Firing rocket after rocket to mark the runner's path, the blockaders would pursue their quarry. Hurried, shoveling pitch pine and rosin chunks into the ship's furnace, the ship's firemen stoked a hotter fire to build speed. Aboard the harried blockade runner, firemen would fuel the ship's furnace with sides of bacon or turpentine-soaked cotton to gain enough speed to outdistance the enemy. Narrow escapes were common, but when capture seemed imminent, a captain would heave to and surrender. More often, he would turn towards shore and try to beach his vessel in the breakers, hoping his cargo could be salvaged later. Now and again, a lighter moment highlighted the chase. In October of 1862, the Caroline was captured after a 6-hour chase off Mobile. When brought aboard the Hartford, her captain protested vehemently to Farragut that he was not headed for Mobile, but for Matamoros, Mexico, as his clearance papers revealed. To this fantastic claim, the old admiral replied, "I do not take you for running the blockade, but for your damn poor navigation. Any man bound for Matamoros from Havana and coming within 12 miles of Mobile Point has no business to have a steamer." When Farragut was ordered to capture New Orleans in January of 1862, the order from Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles specifically mentioned the capture of Mobile as a follow-up measure. Accordingly, the Union occupation of the Crescent City was barely days old when Farragut began planning his operation at Mobile Bay. But President Lincoln and Welles postponed the event until the opening of the Mississippi had been completed, and sent Farragut upriver to cooperate with Flag Officer Charles H. Davis. Farragut hated the river. It was no place for his sloops of war. But there he stayed until Port Hudson and Vicksburg surrendered in July of 1863. All but broken in health from the arduous service in the malaria-ridden lower Mississippi, he took leave of absence. By the summer of 1864, Northerners and Southerners alike believed that action was long overdue at Mobile. As David Dixon Porter, a Union naval officer, once put it, Mobile is so ripe now that it would fall to us like a mellow pear. If Rear Admiral Farragut had his way, it would have been closed off from the sea in 1862. Writing in 1887, an officer who served on board Farragut's flagship said, "It is easy to see now the wisdom of his plan. Had the operation against Mobile been undertaken promptly as he desired, the entrance into the bay would have been effected with much less cost of men and materials. Mobile would have been captured a year earlier than it was, and the Union cause would have been spared the disaster of the Red River campaign of 1864. At this late date, it is but justice to admit the truth." In addition, shortly after his capture of Vicksburg, Ulysses S. Grant proposed that he attack Mobile with the help of the Navy. He thought it would be an ideal base for operating in the Deep South. The request was refused, not once, but 3 times. After his successful operations at Chattanooga, he renewed his proposal, and once again it was denied. General Nathaniel Banks at New Orleans also proposed that he attack Mobile, but he was ordered into Texas on what would turn out to be the ill-fated Red River operation. Then, in January of 1864, a recuperated and rejuvenated Farragut resumed command, and his first act was to make a personal reconnaissance of Mobile. Taking charge of a gunboat in his fleet, he ordered the vessel in close, where I could count the guns and the men who stood by them. Unlike New Orleans, Mobile had prepared well for the onslaught of the Union fleet. This, however, was due less to the rebel tenacity than to the Union's attention to other objectives. Indeed, viewed from afar, a heavy mist of ripeness hovers over the opening days of the summer of 1864. Yet, during the long months that the Confederates had been left in comparatively peaceful possession of Mobile, an elaborate system of fortifications had been created for guarding the entrances to the broad but shallow sandy shoals of the bay. The city itself was at the head of Mobile Bay, about 20 miles from the ocean. On the tip of Mobile Point was erected the pentagonal Fort Morgan, garrisoned by 700 men and 79 guns, which easily commanded the shipping channel, half a mile wide and 21 feet deep. About 3 miles to the west rose Dolphin Island, on the eastern port of which was Fort Gaines, with 26 guns, which commanded Pelican Channel, actually a shallows projecting 2 miles toward the shipping channel. To strengthen and improve the defenses, the Confederates had thrown up obstructions extending in the shallows from Fort Gaines eastward toward Fort Morgan. Of the obstructions in deep water, a row of black buoys marked 3 staggered lines of mines, which were then called torpedoes. They reached directly across the main channel to within 500 yards of Mobile Point, so that passing ships, in order to skirt the minefield, had to pass directly under the guns of Fort Morgan. Farragut well understood the full significance of the ominous black buoys, but he was confident that the submersibles, encrusted with barnacles, their powder damp, were waterlogged and powerless. He also believed a good many had drifted from their moorings. But the danger could not be ignored or taken lightly, and with that in mind, Farragut sent boat crews out at night to find the buoys, then fumble around until they located the mines anchored a few feet deep under the water. When found, they would either be sunk or removed. Formidable as it all looked, the old admiral was not impressed. "I am satisfied," he wrote to Secretary Wells, "that if I had one ironclad at this time, I could destroy their whole force in the bay, and with 5,000 cooperating soldiers from the army, reduce the forts at my leisure." The Tennessee native, who was perhaps the best naval officer on either side, based his superb tactics on an analysis of his shortcomings as well as those of his opponent. This 54-year-old veteran of the Navy understood the limitations of land fortifications, and both on the Mississippi River and at the Mobile Bay, he used this tactical understanding flawlessly. It is revealing that in all his communications with Secretary Wells during this period, Farragut's first consideration was the condition of his opponents, and even more revealing that he was willing to act upon his perceptions of their weakness. This was another indication of Farragut's best case or optimistic approach to the conduct of war. It was easy to see an opponent's strength, but Farragut took a step beyond and tried to comprehend his opponent's problems and limitations. He was also very aware that about 300 miles north of Mobile, at Selma, the Confederates had built one of the largest naval stations. Confederate Secretary of the Navy Stephen Malloy, intent that Mobile not be lost and responding to cries of alarm from the governor of Alabama, contracted 2 floating batteries in May of 1862, the Huntsville and the Tuscaloosa. Originally planned as ironclads, their engines proved inadequate. Barely able to stem the weak current, the ships clearly could not confront the enemy in open battle, but they might work as floating batteries. Moreover, in the fall of 1862, other contracts had been closed, one of which was a powerful screw ship that would become one of the most powerful and famed Confederate ironclads, the Tennessee. All hope was staked on her. Rear Admiral and historian Alfred Thayer Mahan called the Tennessee the most powerful ironclad built from the keel up by the Confederacy. She was probably the most potent craft that sailed from a Confederate Navy yard during the war. Her displacement was 1,273 tons. She was 209 feet long with a 48-foot beam and was fitted with a casemate 79 feet long. The internal structure of the casemate was of yellow pine, 18.5 inches thick, augmented by 4 inches of oak. This was covered by 5 inches of iron plate, increasing to 6 inches forward. Her outer decks were armored with 2.5-inch sheet iron. The lower reaches of the casemate descended under the waterline and formed a solid angle that would make it very difficult to ram the ship. She carried a battery of 6 Brooke rifles, 2 of 7.5 inches forward and astern, pivoted so that they could be fired either from a porthole in front or from 2 ports on the sides. She carried the other 4 of 6 inches in broadsides. Her shallow draft would allow her to find refuge in the broad expanses of 14-foot water that was not accessible to Farragut's heavy warships. Nevertheless, the Tennessee had some serious flaws that would impair her at critical times. First, she was very slow, because her engines, recovered from a river steamer, had been patched together and adapted by a system of connecting gears to give her screw propulsion, resulting in a great dissipation of power. Even though in her engine trials that she had logged 8 knots, when fully loaded she could barely make 6. Second, her port shutters, 5-inch thick, were hinged high. Under enemy fire they might fall and obstruct the portholes. Last and most serious, through some unbelievable oversight, the tiller chains passed over the deck astern and were therefore fully exposed to enemy fire. As our captain said, we were compelled to take the consequences of the defect, which proved to be disastrous. The South had little to work with. Old locomotive boilers were cut and pressed together in new shapes to serve new purposes, while once careful mechanics looked the other way in embarrassment at their tired handiwork, and fatigued machinery of memorable steamers was dismembered and made to serve purposes its designers could not have foreseen. Furthermore, the Tennessee's advantage of shallow draft could be checkmated if Farragut had monitors of similar or even lighter draft. After the loss of New Orleans, the South's hero of Hampton Roads, Admiral Franklin Buchanan, had been ordered to Selma to supervise the building of the Tennessee and the creation of a fleet that would break the Federal blockade. Mallory originally had sent his most aggressive senior officer to Mobile, not only to raise the blockade off that city, but also to cooperate in a combined effort to regain New Orleans and the lower Mississippi. Therefore, his building operations were essentially offensive in motive, but were defensive in fact. For old Buck Buchanan, the battle to come meant victory or defeat for the entire Southern Navy. The Mississippi was lost, for which Galveston and other Texas ports were useless. Charleston and Savannah were bottled up and would stay that way. During the night of May 17th, Buchanan succeeded in getting the Tennessee over to the Dog River Bar below Mobile and into the lower bay. His plan was to run through the blockade and capture nearby Fort Pickens in Pensacola, Florida. But the ironclad ran hard aground in the lower bay after crossing the sandbar and was discovered by blockaders the next morning. Anxious days passed, but neither belligerent made a move. Buchanan seemed overawed by the Union fleet and, believing an attack was imminent, dropped all pretense of offensive action, preparing for the expected blow. Farragut fully believed that Buchanan, who had been refloated at high tide, was waiting for a dark night and smooth sea to renew his sortie. No doubt is felt of his success. Coming on the heels of the rebel successes on the Red River, the public mind is in such a state of excitement, Farragut wrote to Wells. It was believed that if the ram destroyed the blockade off Mobile in the wake of General Banks' failure on the Red River, New Orleans would panic and might be lost. Thus, a naval stalemate developed off Mobile that was to last for the next month and a half. In addition to the Tennessee, Buchanan had 3 wooden gunboats, somewhat comparable to Farragut's lighter ships. They were the Morgan, Gaines, and Selma, with a total of 22 guns, including 4 very effective Brooke rifles, yet they had been converted from river steamers, and their light construction made them poorly suited for the rigors of battle. The greatest faith was in the Tennessee. She was a very powerful ironclad, but her most serious deficiency was that she was alone. The South held absurdly high hopes for her. Buchanan wrote to a friend, "Everybody has taken it into their heads that one ship can whip a dozen, and if the trial is not made, we who are in her are damned for life. Consequently, the trial must be made. So goes the world." The Tennessee was a formidable obstacle, which Farragut would find across his path on the day he determined to attack. To his son, the admiral wrote, "Buchanan has a vessel which he says is superior to the Merrimac, with which he intends to attack us, so we are to have no child's play." By the spring of 1864, the Yankees controlled the Mississippi River system, West Virginia, Tennessee, Virginia north of the Rapidan River, parts of Louisiana, and most of the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. But the bulk of the Confederacy was still intact. Rebel arms controlled the Shenandoah Valley, and 2 powerful armies, Lee's in Virginia and Joe Johnston's in Georgia, remained defiant. Grant, with an army twice the size of Lee's, advanced towards Richmond, but was repulsed with bloody losses in May at the battles of Wilderness and Spotsylvania, and in June at Cold Harbor. General Sherman and his bummers, 80,000 strong, pushed off from Chattanooga, plunging into the deep South toward Atlanta. With Atlanta in sight, Sherman wanted to prevent the Confederate troops in southern Alabama from moving to Johnston's aid. Although not yet prepared to roll the dice, Farragut was at least ready to shake them. Eager to help, he decided he could assist Sherman by pretending to force an entrance into Mobile Bay. On February 13th, he sent 6 mortars to the west of Dauphin Island to attack the small, weak, and unfinished Fort Powell. The mortars, supported by 4 gunboats, put up a fierce display. Confederate General Dabney Murray, military commander of the district, bought the ruse, panicked, and asked Richmond for more troops. Thus, any intention of siphoning off troops from Mobile to defend against Sherman was dropped, and Farragut had accomplished something at the cost of a few mortar shells. Farragut, who up to this time had been scornful of ironclads and now faced an imminent meeting with one, had a touch of ram fever. His reports to Secretary Wells of the appearance of the Tennessee in the lower bay produced prompt action. Wells ordered the ironclad Manhattan to leave the naval yard at Norfolk and report to Farragut. Soon, a second ironclad, the Tecumseh, received the same orders. Furthermore, Admiral David Porter was ordered to send Farragut 2 light draft ironclads from the Mississippi Squadron, the Winnebago and the Chickasaw. All were formidable vessels of the Monitor class, but much more powerful than the famed prototype. The Manhattan and the Tecumseh displaced 2,100 tons, were 225 feet long, and had much stronger armor than had been used earlier. The most important asset was their ordnance. Each had 2 gigantic 15-inch Dahlgrens, the same caliber used by the 40,000-ton battleships of World War II, capable of firing projectiles weighing more than 430 pounds. The twin-turreted quadruple-screw river monitors, although built to operate in shallow inland waters, would prove themselves extremely efficient. They were 229 feet long, displaced 1,300 tons, and held 4 11-inch Dahlgrens. The arrival of the first Monitor was the signal for Farragut to prepare his ships in earnest for the attack. The old admiral must have sensed that fortune had brought the impossible of 3 months ago within the reach of his courageous grasp, and so convinced was he of the ripeness of the moment, he refused to procrastinate. To increase pressure on Joe Johnston's army early in June, Sherman wired General Edward Canby, who had relieved Banks after his dismal Red River campaign, and asked him to raise a ruckus with Farragut at Mobile. On June 17th, General Canby conferred with Farragut, and on July 3rd sent him General Gordon Granger with 2,400 troops to land in the rear and invest Fort Gaines. They were all that could be spared at the time, because General Canby had been ordered to send reinforcements to the Army of the Potomac, which would eventually operate in the Shenandoah Valley under General Phil Sheridan. General Page, who commanded at Fort Morgan, was convinced his firepower was inadequate, although General Murray was certain of the fort's obstructions and the Tennessee would obliterate Farragut's squadron. Farragut was obviously expecting the hottest contest of his career. I know Buchanan and Page, both officers of known merit in the old Navy, will do all in their power to destroy us, and we will reciprocate the compliment. I hope to give them a fair fight if I once get inside, he wrote to his son. Fort Morgan, built in 1818 as part of the Coastal Defense Program begun after the disastrous British landing in the War of 1812, was obsolete in 1864 and unable to withstand the fire of powerful rifled guns. However, the weakest aspect of the fort was the Mobile Point Peninsula. Low and sandy, it presented no obstacle to the landing of troops seeking to take Fort Morgan from the rear. Moreover, despite the fear the torpedoes inspired, they were the weakest point of the Mobile Bay defenses. According to the Confederate commander of the Corps of Engineers, the Prussian Victor von Schiller, they were anchored on shifting sands and unstable gravel. Furthermore, the Confederates had also been obliged to leave a 500-yard gap between Fort Morgan and the torpedo field to allow passage of blockade runners. Admiral Mahan later correctly observed that if the Confederates had laid electrical torpedoes, they would have been able to close the whole bay and channel. Because they did not, they were limited to obstructing the western part of the channel by a triple line of contact torpedoes that they hoped would force enemy ships under Fort Morgan's guns. Had they been used, electrical torpedoes could have been connected to Fort Morgan by cable for turning on and off depending on what sort of ship was approaching. Instead, contact torpedoes, which can become ineffective from prolonged immersion, were laid in 3 lines along the western part of the channel and were marked with black buoys. To avoid this threat, ships entering the bay were forced to pass under the guns of Fort Morgan. Farragut's fleet prepared for action. They stowed superfluous spars below, rigged splinter nets on the starboard sides, barricaded the helms with sails and hammocks, heaved hempen fenders over the inboard sides, and spread chains and sandbags around the deck machinery. To prevent disabled craft from jamming up the battle line, the smaller gunboats were lashed side by side with chains and were to run up to the forts in pairs, just as Farragut had done at New Orleans and Port Hudson. The spearhead of the attack was to be the 4 monitors and was to proceed in advance of the starboard bow off the main column of 7 pairs of wooden ships carrying a broadside of 75 guns. The lead monitor, Tecumseh, had orders to hug Mobile Point and lead them to the right of the most eastern buoy, which marked the minefield. Although the column of wooden ships was not to pass at such close range to Fort Morgan, it also was to clear the eastern end of the ominous markers. Farragut made his plans, and the Confederates made theirs. On July 28th, the Tennessee cruised the bay, majestically, calmly engaged in target practice, and from the deck of the Hartford, Farragut watched 400 miserably clad, half-drilled cadets from Mobile, boys 14 to 18, arrive at Fort Gaines to reinforce the garrison. On the western end of Dolphin Island, Granger's troops, on August 3rd, landing with difficulty in the heavy surf, lugged 6 3-inch Rodman rifles 7 miles through sand and planted them 1,200 yards from Fort Gaines. Trenches were shoveled. Watching them, Farragut wrote, "I can lose no more days. I must go in day after tomorrow morning, or a little later. It is a bad time, but when you do not take fortune at her offer, you must take her as you can find her." Farragut fretted all day long on August 4th, waiting for the sight of the Tecumseh, which had not arrived from Pensacola. He slept poorly. Of the grave ponderings that may have troubled his mind, or the dreams that visit his sleep, history cannot say. It rained hard about sundown, cleared, and under a half-moon and a half-black sky salted with shimmering stars, a comet flashed across the sky. Even the most hard-bitten salt, filled with the superstitions of the sea, had to admit that the heavens were offering an omen of victory. For whom, Farragut or Buchanan, was an issue that would be decided presently. About 3 a.m., Farragut awoke, dressed, and ate breakfast with his chief of staff. As he sipped hot tea, he sent his steward to ascertain the direction of the wind and the condition of the weather. When informed that there was a light wind from the southwest and the sea was all but dead calm, he put his fork down and quietly declared, "Well, Drayton, we might as well get under way." Aboard the Tennessee, conditions were horrendous. The officers and crew had lived savagely since crossing into the lower bay. Rains came nearly every day, and with them, said Surgeon Daniel Conrad, the terrible, moist, hot atmosphere stimulating that oppressiveness which precedes a tornado. Sleep was impossible, from the want of properly cooked food and the continuous wetting of decks at night. The officers and men were rendered desperate. All hands looked forward to the impending battle, whatever the outcome, with a positive feeling of relief. For weeks, Conrad watched the Federal ships multiply outside the bay. Stripped for action, they appeared like prize fighters ready for the ring. At daybreak on August 5th, the doctor and his admiral were roused by the quartermaster and informed that the enemy ships were under way. They climbed to the hurricane deck, Buchanan painfully limping from the wound suffered at Hampton Roads. Upon seeing Farragut making for the main channel, Buchanan nodded and turned to the skipper. "Get under way, Mr. Johnson," he said. "Head for the leading vessel of the enemy and fight each one as they pass us." If there was valor and superlative fighting metal to be shown, these sons of the Confederacy would show it. If David Farragut wanted the title of hero, he would have to earn it. With a bright sun rising and a cloudless sky, October 5th promised to be a typical summer's day. In fact, it had, indeed, produced ideal conditions for Farragut. The southwesterly wind would carry the smoke of the battle into the eyes of the gunners at Fort Morgan, and there was an early morning flood tide that would carry damaged ships past the fort into the bay. As the fleet swung into motion, a solitary Yankee gun signaled Granger's troops on Dauphin Island to commence firing at Fort Gaines. Infantrymen, sweating and blackened, threw off their clothing, cursed the boiling sun, and poured shot and shell into the rebel earthworks. The curtain was now raised on this drama. At 6:22, the Tecumseh, which had arrived at 2 a.m., leading the Monitor line, opened the battle, firing a ranging shot from each of her monster 15-inch guns. Farragut signaled for closer order. Each pair of vessels, a few yards apart, echeloned a bit to starboard, and helped by the flood tide, swept majestically onward. At 7:06, range half a mile, Fort Morgan opened fire, immediately answered by the leading Brooklyn with her forward Parrott rifles. It is a curious sight to catch a single shot from so heavy a piece of ordnance, observed a surgeon on the USS Lackawanna, recalling the impression left from the view of the first shell from Fort Morgan. First, you see a puff of white smoke upon the distant ramparts, and then you see the shot coming, looking exactly as if some gigantic hand had thrown in play a ball toward you. By the time it is halfway, you get the boom of the report, and then the howl of the missile, which apparently grows so rapidly in size that every green hand on board who can see it is certain that it will hit them right between the eyes. Then, as it goes past with a shriek like 1,000 devils, the inclination to do reverence is so strong that it is impossible to resist. As the Monitor Division approached Fort Morgan, the Tennessee and the gunboats Selma, Gaines, and Morgan steamed from under the shelter side of Mobile Point and took position across the main channel, but behind the minefield. Buchanan had executed the classic naval maneuver of crossing Farragut's T. In minutes, a galling and murderous raking fire was loosed down the long axis of the Federal line. Meanwhile, the column of wooden ships was coming up on the port quarter of the Monitor Division, sailing into position where they belched a stunning barrage upon Fort Morgan. Confederate fire slackened appreciably. Farragut, in order to discern the course of the battle and the resulting pall of smoke, climbed high into the main rigging, and as the smoke grew heavier, ascended rung by rung to just under the main top. Captain Drayton, who remembered that the Admiral suffered mildly from vertigo, and fearing that he might have a bad fall if wounded, sent a quartermaster aloft to pass a line around him and secure him to the rigging. Thus originated the story that Farragut went into the battle lashed to the mast. This much-publicized incident was merely a safety precaution while the Admiral was in exposed position to get a better view of what was going on. The pilot was also in the main rigging for the same reason, and he had a voice tube to the captain on deck. Farragut had hardly gained his position when he saw the impetuous Tecumseh along the line of buoys that marked the minefield. Captain Tunis Craver of the Tecumseh looked through the heavy-grilled port of his tiny smoke-filled conning tower and is alleged to have decided that there was not enough room for him to pass to the right or eastward of the designated buoy. He'd clanged 4 bells to the engine room and tried to pass the Rose at full speed. It seems that, confident of the vessel's invulnerability and the destructive power of her enormous 15-inch Dahlgrens, he was intent on being the first to get at the Tennessee. It is definitively known that after he fired the 1 round from each of his guns at Fort Morgan, he immediately reloaded them with the maximum possible charges of powder, holding them for the Tennessee. As Catesby Jones had recommended, artillerists at Fort Morgan fired calmly, accurately, and below the waterline at the Union ironclads. He had been a lieutenant on board the CSS Virginia and had commanded the ram after Buchanan fell. Now, as head of the Selma Cannon Foundry, he had supplied the fort with a few of the Revolutionary Brooke rifles and had written to General Page with his well-considered views. At 7:30, the Tecumseh, abreast of the fort, was hit by at least 2 steel-cored armor-piercing projectiles. It veered off course, steaming farther into the torpedo field. Suddenly, there was a fearful explosion, and instantly a towering geyser of water shot from the bow. Her hull smashed, the ironclad lurched and heeled to port, as from an earthquake shock. For one brief moment, sinking by the bow, her propeller could be seen racing madly in the air. Then she foundered, dragging into the chasm her captain and 92 men. Immediately, said Surgeon Conrad of the Tennessee, immense bubbles of steam as large as cauldrons rose to the surface of the water. Only 8 human beings could be seen in the turmoil. John Collins, the Tecumseh's pilot, was one of them. He and Captain Craven stood at the ladder of the turret roof. "After you, pilot," said the captain. "There was nothing after me," Collins said later. "When I reached the utmost rung of the ladder, the vessel seemed to drop from under me. Some men leaped from the side and swam away from the suction. Everywhere, for a few moments, an eerie silence took hold as men stared. At Fort Morgan, General Page ordered his gunners to hold their fire against the boats that were rescuing survivors." Thanks for watching this episode of Mad Hatter's Civil War History. Like, follow, and click the bell for notifications to ensure you see all the latest content. As always, let me know if there's any other important events of the American Civil War you would like me to address.